My name is Emma Thompson, and I'm 48 years old, and I own Coastal Heights Realty, a real estate firm I built from nothing but 16-hour days and a knack for closing deals in Vancouver, Canada. And I've been married to Lucas Bennett for 14 years, and I've been best friends with Sophie for just as long. And I thought I knew what trust was, until the night it all came crashing down. I got home late that evening around 9:30, still in my blazer, from a client meeting that ran long because I was trying to secure a multi-million-dollar condo development deal that would put my company on the map, and I was exhausted with my heels pinching my feet and my shoulders tight from stress. But that was normal for me, because that's what it takes to run a business like mine. I walked into the kitchen, expecting to see Lucas maybe heating up dinner or scrolling on his phone like he usually did, but the house was quiet, too quiet, and his car was in the driveway, which was odd, because he'd been working late himself. "Lately or so," he said, and I set my bag on the counter, noticing his phone sitting there face down, which wasn't unusual, except it buzzed right as I looked at it, and something in my gut twisted hard, like it knew before I did. I don't know why I picked up the phone, because I'm not the type to snoop, and I've never needed to check Lucas's messages in 14 years of marriage. But that night, the silence in the house, and the way his phone kept buzzing like it was, demanding to be seen, made my hand move before my brain caught up, and I swiped it open, and there it was, a text from Sophie, my best friend, since we were in our 20s, the woman who was maid of honor at my wedding, the godmother to our daughter Mia, the person I called when my first big deal fell through, and when Lucas and I lost our second pregnancy. And the message said, "Left my scarf upstairs. Don't tell Emma." I stopped by, and my whole body went cold. Not with shock, but with this sick certainty like I'd been punched in the chest and the air was gone. I stood there, staring at the screen, my hands shaking, because it wasn't just the words, it was the way they were written. So casual like this, was normal, like Sophie dropping by my house, and leaving her scarf in my bedroom, was just another Tuesday, and I thought about how Lucas had been different lately. Always distracted, always stepping out to take calls, he said. Were from clients, but he'd smile too quick when he came back, and how Sophie had been finding reasons to meet me for coffee less often, saying she was swamped with her own real estate projects, but she'd text Lucas about some joint venture they were supposedly working on together, and I'd believed it. Because why wouldn't I, when these were the two people I trusted most in the world? I gripped the phone tighter and my stomach churned, because I remembered how Sophie had started wearing this new perfume to our last team meeting at the office, and how Lucas had complimented it in this offhand way that felt too familiar, and I'd brushed it off because you don't throw away 14 years of friendship over a hunch, but now it was staring me in the face and I couldn't unsee it. I took a deep breath and set the phone back down, exactly where it was, because I didn't want Lucas to know I'd seen anything yet. And I walked upstairs slowly, my heels clicking on the hardwood, and each step felt heavier like I was carrying the weight of what I was about to find. And I pushed open the bedroom door, and there was Lucas sitting on the edge of our bed, holding Sophie's red cashmere scarf, the one I'd bought her for her 40th birthday, and he looked up at me, and his face went pale, like he knew the second he saw me that the game was up. "Emma," he said, "just my name," and it hung there between us like a confession, and I held up my hand because I didn't want to hear whatever excuse he was about to spin, and I said, "You left your phone downstairs and it's been buzzing," and his eyes that widened because he knew what that meant, and he didn't even try to deny it. He just sat there clutching her scarf, his shoulders slumped like a man who'd been caught red-handed. I stood in the doorway, feeling this rage building inside me, not the loud screaming kind, but the quiet kind that burns slow and sharp, and I said, "How long has this been going on?" And he looked at the floor and muttered, "You're always working. Emma, you're never here," and Sophie was just there for me, and I laughed this bitter, ugly laugh, because after 14 years of building a life together, of raising Mia, of buying our dream house in Kitsilano, he was blaming me for his betrayal. And I said, "So it's my fault you're sneaking around with my best friend." And he didn't answer, which was answer enough. I turned and walked back downstairs, my mind racing, because it wasn't just Lucas, it was Sophie too, the woman who'd cried with me when my dad died, who'd invested $20,000 in Coastal Heights when I was just starting out, who'd promised to always have my back, and now she was stabbing it. I grabbed my keys from the counter and got in my car and drove to the office because I couldn't stay in that house another second, and I sat at my desk in the dark, staring at the city lights through the window, and the pain was there, this raw ache in my chest. But something else was growing too, something colder and clearer like a switch had flipped, and I knew I wasn't going to cry or beg or fall apart because I'd spent my life building something real, a company, a family, a legacy, and I wasn't going to let them take it from me. I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer's private line because I was done ignoring the rot, and it was time to start cutting it out piece by piece, and I felt this strange calm settle over me because I was already thinking 3 steps ahead, and I knew exactly what I was going to do next. That night in the office, after finding Sophie's scarf on my bed and hearing Lucas blame me for his betrayal, I didn't sleep because my mind was racing with every moment. I'd missed every sign I'd ignored, and I kept replaying 14 years of marriage and friendship, wondering how I'd been so blind when the truth was screaming at me. I sat there in the dark with my phone in my hand staring at the screen, because I'd taken a picture of that text from Sophie before I put Lucas's phone back, and it was burning a hole in my brain, and I kept thinking about how Sophie had been acting different for months, always checking her phone during our meetings at Coastal Heights Realty, always quick to leave when I asked about her latest deals, and how Lucas had started staying late at his own office, claiming he was meeting with developers, but he'd come home smelling like that same perfume Sophie wore, and I'd told myself it was nothing, because you don't just assume the 2 people you love most would do this to you. I went back home the next morning because I had to face Lucas and act like I didn't know everything, even though my stomach was churning, and I was so angry I could barely look at him, and he was in the kitchen making coffee like it was any other day, and he said, "You were out late, Emma. Everything okay?" And I wanted to scream at him for acting so normal, but I just nodded and said, "Client meeting ran long," and I watched him sip his coffee and check his phone, and I noticed how he tilted the screen away from me like he was hiding something, and that was new because Lucas used to leave his phone anywhere and never cared who saw it. And I realized he'd been doing this for weeks, maybe months, and I'd been too busy closing deals to notice. I didn't say anything because I needed to know more, needed to be sure, before I burned everything down, and I went upstairs to shower and think, and that's when I saw Sophie's scarf still on the bed, where Lucas had left it like a trophy, and I grabbed it and stuffed it in a drawer, because I couldn't stand looking at it. But I wasn't ready to confront him yet, not until I had proof that would bury them both. I started paying attention to everything after that, because once you see the crack, you can't stop seeing it. And Lucas and Sophie were careless, like they thought I was too distracted to catch on. And maybe I had been, but not anymore, and I noticed how Lucas started mentioning Sophie more often, saying she'd stopped by the office to discuss a joint project on a downtown condo tower. And I'd nod and smile, but I'd check the company calendar later, and there were no meetings scheduled with her, and I thought about how Sophie had invested $20,000 in Coastal Heights when I started it 14 years ago, taking a 10% stake because she believed in me, and we'd built it together, and now she was using that to get close to my husband. I went through my own emails one night, when Lucas was out supposedly at a client dinner, and I found a thread between him and Sophie about a property deal, but the dates didn't add up because they were meeting at times when I was at the play office, and the emails were vague, like they were covering something, and one of them said, "Don't mention this to Emma yet," and my blood boiled, because it wasn't just an affair, it was them sneaking around my company, my life, like I was some obstacle to dodge. I kept it together during the day, because I had to run Coastal Heights and meet clients and smile through presentations, but every night, I'd dig deeper, and I started noticing Sophie's car parked near our house in Kitsilano when I'd get home, early from a showing, and she'd text me right after saying she was just in the neighborhood, dropping off paperwork, but there was never any paperwork, and I'd see Lucas's phone light up with her name, and he'd step outside to take the call and come back acting like it was nothing, and I wanted to grab him and demand answers. But I knew I had to be smarter than that, because anger alone wouldn't get me justice. I called my assistant Jenna, who's been with me for years, and I asked her to pull the access logs for our office because Sophie had a keycard, and I wanted to know when she'd been there. And Jenna didn't ask questions because she could tell something was wrong, and the logs showed Sophie swiping in after hours on nights. Lucas was supposedly working late, and I felt this sick twist in my gut because it was so clear. Now they weren't even trying to hide it, they were just banking on me being too busy to notice. I decided to check Lucas's laptop one night when he was asleep because I needed more than suspicions, and I waited until he was snoring and slipped into his office, and his password was still the same one he'd used for years, Mia's birthday, which almost made me laugh because he hadn't even bothered to change it. And I found a folder labeled Client Proposals, but inside were photos of him and Sophie at a restaurant downtown, laughing close together, and emails about hotel bookings, and one message from Sophie saying, "We need to be careful. Emma's been asking questions." And I sat there in the dark with the screen glowing and my hands shaking, because this wasn't just a fling. This was months of lies and planning and betrayal, and I felt this rage so deep, it scared me. But it also made everything crystal clear, and I copied everything to a USB drive because I wasn't going to let them talk their way out of this. I met with my lawyer David Monroe the next day because I'd called him that first night and he'd been waiting for me to decide what to do. And we sat in his office downtown, and I slid the USB across his desk and said I want to protect my company and my life. And he looked through the files and said, "This is enough to trigger the partnership clause we wrote when Sophie invested." And I nodded because I remembered that clause, the one that let me buy out a partner for actions that hurt the company's reputation. And David said it'll mean paying her out at a reduced rate and probably 15 cents on the dollar. And I said, I don't care, because I wanted Sophie out of my business and out of my life. And I told him about the prenup Lucas and I signed 14 years ago with an infidelity clause that would cut him off from everything we'd built together. And David leaned back and said, "This is going to get messy." Emma and I said, "It's already messy. I'm just cleaning it up." I left his office feeling this strange calm because I was angry and hurt, but I was also in control, and I knew I was going to take back everything they'd tried to steal from me, and I wasn't going to stop until it was done. After meeting with David, my lawyer, and handing over the USB with all the proof of Lucas and Sophie's betrayal, I went home that night, feeling this fire in my chest because I was done pretending everything was fine, and I was ready to face on them both and make them see what they'd done to me. And I knew it was going to be ugly, but I didn't care because I'd spent 14 years building Coastal Heights Realty and a life with Lucas, and I wasn't going to let them tear it apart without a fight. I walked into the house around 7 in the evening, and Lucas was in the living room, scrolling on his phone, and he looked up and said, "You're home early. Emma thought you had a late showing." And I just stared at him because the way he said it, so casual, like he hadn't been sneaking around with my best friend for months, made my blood boil. And I said, "We need to talk." And he set his phone down, face down like always, and I could see the flicker of worry in his eyes, and I knew he was already trying to figure out what I'd found. I didn't sit down because I needed to stay in control, and I pulled the USB from my purse and set it on the coffee table and said, "I know about you and Sophie." And his face went white like I'd slapped him, and he started to say something like, "Emma, let me explain." But I cut him off and said, "Don't bother, because I've seen the emails and the photos and the hotel bookings, and I know she's been coming here when I'm at work and leaving her scarf in our bedroom." And he just sat there, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't find the words. And I felt this surge of anger because after 14 years of marriage and raising Mia together, he didn't even have the guts to admit it. I said, "How long has this been going on?" And he looked away and muttered, "You're always at the office, Emma. You're never here." And Sophie understood me, and I laughed this hard, bitter laugh because he was trying to make it my fault, just like I'd expected. and I said, "So you betray me with my best friend because I'm working to keep our company alive." And he didn't answer, just stared at the floor, and I knew I had him cornered. I told him I'd already talked to my lawyer and showed him the prenup we signed when we got married, the one with the infidelity clause that said, if either of us cheated, we'd lose any claim to the assets we built together, including Coastal Heights, and his eyes widened because he'd forgotten about that paper we'd signed 14 years ago when my parents insisted on protecting their investment in my first property deal, and he said, "You can't be serious, Emma, that thing's ancient," and I said, "It's legal. And it's ironclad, and I've got enough proof to make it stick." And he leaned forward, his voice shaking, and said, "You'd throw away our marriage over this." And I said, "You threw it away, Lucas. Every time you chose her over me." And I felt this strange calm settle over me because I was furious, but I was also in charge and I could see him crumbling. I didn't stop there because I needed to deal with Sophie too, and I called her the next morning and asked her to meet me at the office after hours, and I said it was about the downtown condo project, so she wouldn't suspect anything, and she showed up around 8, looking like she always did in her tailored blazer and that damn perfume, and she smiled and said, "Hey Emma, what's so urgent?" And I didn't smile back. I just slid a folder across my desk and said, "Open it," and she did. Her face changed as she flipped through the papers I'd printed from the USB. The emails, the photos, the office access logs showing her sneaking in with Lucas, and the partnership clause from when she invested $20,000 in Coastal Heights 14 years ago. I said, "I'm triggering the clause, Sophie, because your actions are hurting my company's reputation, and I'm buying out your 10% stake at 15 cents on the dollar." And her eyes went wide, and she said, "You can't do this. Emma, we've been friends for years." And I said, "Exactly. And you stabbed me in the back with my husband." And she tried to play it off, saying it wasn't what it looked like. And Lucas was lonely, and it just happened. And I felt my anger flare because she was using the same excuse as him, like I was some fool who'd buy it. I leaned forward and said, "You don't get to talk your way out of this, because I've got proof you've been meeting him behind my back for months, and you've been careless enough to leave a trail." And she got angry, then her voice rising, and she said, "You've been absent. Emma always working, always chasing the next deal, and Lucas needed someone." And I almost laughed because they were both blaming me like I'd pushed them into each other's arms. And I said, "So it's my fault you betrayed me," and she didn't. Your answer just pushed the folder back and said, "I'm not signing anything." And I nodded and said, "That's fine, because the clause doesn't need your signature, and my lawyer's already drafting the buyout." And she stood up, slamming her hand on the Agos desk, and said, "Lucas won't let you do this. He'll back me up." And I just looked at her and said, "Go ahead and call him, because I've already shown him the same proof, and he's got his own problems now." Sophie stormed out, and I sat back in my chair, feeling my heart pounding, because confronting her was like ripping open a wound, but it also felt good, because I was taking back control, and I knew she'd call Lucas, and they'd try to figure out a way to fight me. But I was ready for it, because I'd spent days going through every detail with David, and he'd warned me it would get messy, but he'd also said I had the upper hand, and I believed him. I went home that night, and Lucas was waiting for me in the kitchen, his face red with anger, and he said, "What did you do to Sophie? She's freaking out." And I poured myself a coffee and said, "I showed her the truth, just like I showed you." And he slammed his fist on the counter and said, "You're trying to ruin us both." And I set my mug down and looked him in the eye and said, "You ruined us, Lucas, when you decided to lie to me, and I'm just making sure you don't take anything that's mine." And he went quiet, because he knew I wasn't bluffing, and I could see the fear in his eyes, and I felt this cold satisfaction because they'd thought they could play me, but I was done being their fool. I told Lucas to sleep in the guest room because I couldn't stand sharing a bed with him anymore, and I spent the night going through our company's client contracts because I'd remembered something David said about protecting my business. I realized most of our deals were signed with my personal guarantee, not Coastal Heights' name, and that meant the clients were loyal to me, not Sophie or the company logo. And I felt this spark of hope because I was starting to see a way to cut them out. Completely. And I knew the next step was going to be brutal, but I was ready to do whatever it took to make them pay for what they'd done to me and my family and my life. After confronting Lucas and Sophie and watching them squirm under the weight of their own lies, I went back to the office the next morning because I wasn't going to let them see me break, and I had a plan to take back everything they'd tried to steal from me, and I was going to execute it with the same precision I'd used to build Coastal Heights Realty into one of Vancouver's top firms. I met with David Monroe, my lawyer, first thing, because we'd already started the paperwork to trigger the partnership clause against Sophie, and he had the buyout agreement ready, and he slid it across his desk and said this will force Sophie to sell her 10% stake at 15 cents on the dollar, which means her share worth $300,000 will cost you $45,000. And I nodded, because it was a small price to pay to get her out of my company and out of my life. And David said, the prenup against Lucas is airtight too, and with the proof you've got, he won't get a dime of the business or the house. And I felt this cold satisfaction because I'd spent 14 years building something real, and now I was making sure neither of them could touch it. I told David to send the buyout papers to Sophie's lawyer that day because I wanted her to feel the walls closing in, and I spent the rest of the morning calling my top clients, the ones who'd signed multi-million-dollar deals with Coastal Heights for condo developments and retail spaces, and I set up meetings with them because I'd realized after going through the contracts that most were tied to my personal guarantee, not the company's name, and that meant they were loyal to me, not Sophie or some logo. And I met with Michael Reed, the CEO of Pacific Towers, who'd just signed a $10 million project with us, and I told him about the internal restructuring at Coastal Heights and assured him it wouldn't affect our work, and he shook my hand and said, Emma, we signed with you, not your partner. And I walked out of that meeting knowing I'd locked in one of our biggest revenue streams, and I did the same with 2 other clients that week, securing 80% of our annual income with new agreements that followed me, not the company. Sophie called me the next day, screaming because she'd gotten the buyout papers, and she said, you can't do this, Emma. It's not fair, and I'll fight you in court. And I just let her talk, because I knew she didn't have a leg to stand on, and David, I had already warned me. She'd try to push back, and I said, Sophie, you signed the partnership agreement 14 years ago, and you broke it when you decided to sleep with my husband and hurt my company's reputation. And she went quiet because she knew I was right. And then she tried to play the friend card, saying, we've been through so much together, don't throw it away. And I felt my anger flare because she had the nerve to act like I was the one ending our friendship, and I said you threw it away when you walked into my house and my bed, and she hung up, and I knew she was out of moves. David called later and said Sophie's lawyer had advised her to sign because fighting would only drag it out and cost her more. And by the end of the week, she'd signed the papers, and her 10% stake was mine for $45,000. And I felt this weight lift because one piece of the betrayal was gone. Lucas was harder to deal with because he was still in the house, acting like we could work things out, and he'd come into the kitchen every morning making coffee and saying, we need to talk, Emma, we can fix this, and I'd just pour my own coffee and say, there's nothing to fix because you made your choice, and I've made mine, and I could see the panic in his eyes because he was starting to realize the prenup was real, and he'd lose everything we'd built together. And one night, he got angry and said, you're trying to destroy me and Sophie both. And I looked at him and said, you destroyed us when you lied to me for months, and I'm just protecting what's mine. And he slammed his mug down and stormed out, and I didn't care because I was done carrying his guilt. I met with David again to finalize the divorce papers, and he said the infidelity clause will leave Lucas with nothing but a small settlement, maybe $50,000 to start over. And I said, that's more than he deserves. And David nodded and said, you've got this under control. Emma and I did, because I was moving pieces like a chess game, and I was winning. I started noticing things in the company books while I was securing clients because I'd asked Jenna, my assistant, to pull financial records going back 3 years, and I found discrepancies that made my stomach turn like payments to vendors for properties we never listed. and expense reports for client dinners that never happened, and all of them were approved by. Sophie and I realized she'd been skimming money, probably to fund her weekends. With Lucas and Jenna ran the numbers, and said it added up to $120,000 over 2 years. And I felt this sick rage, because it wasn't just my marriage and friendship, they'd betrayed it was my company too. And I took the records to David and said, I want to use this, and he said, it's enough to press charges for embezzlement, but you could also use it as leverage. And I thought about it, and decided to call Sophie one last time. I told her to meet me at a coffee shop, because I didn't want her in my office anymore, and she showed up looking tired and defeated. And I slid a folder across the table with the financial records, and said, I know you've been stealing from Coastal Heights, and her face went pale, and she said it wasn't like that I was going to pay it back. And I said, with what money, Sophie? Because you've got nothing left now. And I told her I'd keep the audit private if she walked away quietly, and didn't fight the buyout, or try to contact Lucas again. And she just stared at the folder and nodded, because she knew I had her. And I felt this strange mix of anger and relief, because she was finally out of my life for good. Lucas tried to call me after that, because Sophie must have told him what happened, and he left voicemails saying, we need to talk, Emma, you're going too far. But I didn't call back because I was done listening to his excuses, and I focused on the next step, which was making sure Coastal Heights was mine alone. I met with a bigger firm called West Coast Properties a week later because their CEO, Sarah Nguyen, had reached out after hearing about my restructuring, and she said they'd been looking to acquire a firm like Coastal Heights to expand their portfolio. And I realized this was my chance to get out clean and start fresh, because the company was tainted. Now a reminder of Sophie and Lucas's betrayal, and I negotiated a deal to sell Coastal Heights for $15 million with the condition that I'd stay on as a consultant for 2 years, bringing my client relationships with me, and I knew it was the right move because it gave me the money and the freedom to rebuild my life on my terms, and I felt this calm settle over me because I'd taken back everything they'd tried to take from me, and I was ready to move forward. 2 weeks after I negotiated the deal to sell Coastal Heights Realty to West Coast Properties, I sat in their boardroom across from Sarah Nguyen, their CEO, and her legal team, and we were finalizing the acquisition papers that would hand over my company for $15 million. And I felt this quiet calm, because I'd turned a business tainted by Lucas and Sophie's betrayal into a clean break that gave me the freedom to start over. And I signed my name on the last page, and Lubsavand slid the contract back to Sarah, and she smiled and said, you're one of the toughest negotiators I've ever met. Emma and I want you on my team. And I nodded because I'd agreed to stay on as a consultant for 2 years, bringing my client relationships and deal closing skills with me. And I knew it was the right move, because it meant I could walk away from the past without losing everything I'd built. As I left the boardroom, Sarah's assistant came in and said, there's a miss. Laurent here to see you. And I felt my stomach tighten, because I hadn't seen Sophie since our last meeting at the coffee shop, but I told the assistant to let her in because I wanted to see what she had to say, and Sophie walked in looking nothing like the confident woman I'd known for 14 years. Her eyes tired, and her blazer wrinkled, and she said, you sold the company without even telling me, and I stood up and said, you lost the right to know when you stole from me, and slept with my husband. And her face twisted, and she said, you've taken everything from me. Emma and I just looked at her and said you took it from yourself, and I walked out because I was done letting her make me feel guilty. The divorce with Lucas was finalized a month later, and I'd kept my promise to give him a small settlement, $50,000, which was more than he deserved, but I wanted it clean and final, and the prenup held up in court just like David said it would, and Lucas didn't fight it, because he knew he'd lose. And I heard from mutual friends that he and Sophie tried to stay together for a while after everything fell apart, but it didn't last because he couldn't keep up the lifestyle she wanted not. Without my company's money, and Sophie's reputation in the real estate world was shot because word had gotten around about her buyout and the financial discrepancies, and nobody wanted to work with her. Lucas ended up taking a low-level sales job with a small property management firm in Burnaby, a huge step down for a man who'd once been married to the head of Coastal Heights. And I didn't feel sorry for him, because he'd made his choices, and now he was living with them, and I was finally free to live with mine. I bought a new condo in Yaletown a few months later. Not the Kitsilano house I'd shared with Lucas, but a sleek, modern place with floor-to-ceiling windows and a balcony where I could sit with my coffee and think about everything I'd been through, and I started working on a passion project, restoring a vintage Vespa I'd bought because I'd always wanted one since I was a kid, and it gave me something to focus on that wasn't tied to the past. Mia came home from university one weekend, and we had dinner together, and she said she was proud of me for standing up for myself, and I felt this warmth in my chest because my daughter was still in my life, and that was worth more than any deal I'd ever closed. And I texted her back whenever she reached out because I wanted her to know I'd always be there no matter what. I kept in touch with Jenna, my assistant who'd stayed on with West Coast Properties, and she told me Sophie had moved to Calgary, trying to start over, but nobody trusted her after what happened, and she was scraping by with small freelance gigs, and I didn't wish her well, but I didn't wish her harm either, because I was done letting her live in my head. A year after finding Sophie's scarf on my bed, I was standing in my new office at West Coast Properties, looking over proposals for a new development, and I realized I wasn't the same woman I'd been before all this happened because I'd lost a marriage and a best friend, and a company I'd poured my life into, but I'd gained something too, this clarity about who I could trust and what I was capable of, and I had $15 million in investments working for me and a daughter, who still called me mom, and a life that was mine again. I thought about Lucas and Sophie sometimes, but not with anger anymore. Just this quiet understanding that they'd shown me who they were, and I'd shown them who I could be, and that was enough. I learned the hard way that trust is fragile and betrayal cuts deep, but I also learned I could rebuild from nothing and come out stronger, and that lesson cost me everything, but it was worth every penny, because it gave me back myself, and nobody could take that away.